But as Brent said, I've been a member of this group for over 20 years, but it wasn't until 5 years ago when I actually found out I had a family member who was in the 8th Air Force. So I found my biological mother in 2016 and had a 5-year relationship with her before she passed. And she had an uncle named Arthur Watson, who was in the 95th Bomb Group. Now, I thought that was pretty incredible. Here I go, 15 years in this organization, just love World War II. My grandfather served, as Brent mentioned, and then I find out that I actually have a blood family member who was in the 95th Bomb Group, so that was pretty special. So,
Tim?
Yes, sir.
Would you speak to how one of the first times you spoke at this group, you were catching the airplane that afternoon to go meet a family member that you, and I couldn't believe you'd actually take the time to come speak at our group while going to meet a biological family member.
Yeah, that was October of 2016. I presented my first book at the retirement home where we used to meet, Claremont Place. And my wife was with me, and we had a pretty tight window because we were getting on a plane that afternoon. That was a Saturday to fly to Chicago. And who was I going to meet? My biological father for the first time. So we flew in that night, had cocktails and dinner with my brother. He kind of put my mind at ease. And then the next day I walk in and I meet my biological father and his daughter, who is my sister. They had the same birthday, so they shared their birthdays together every year. He lived in Buffalo, she lived in Chicago, so that was pretty special. So that's what we were doing, going to see my biological father for the first time.
I had asked Tim to come speak at our group like a few months before, and Tim shows up that day to speak, and I'm like, what you got going on? And he goes, oh, I'm going to go meet my biological father this afternoon. I'm like, are you here?
Yeah, that was pretty funny. Yeah,
That's the
yeah.
kind of guy Tim is.
Yeah, and everybody's been asking me to write a book about that because, my father doesn't marry my mother. He marries another woman. They're married for 55 years. He passed away on December 25th, 2023 on Christmas Day. He had 2 children with his wife. They look nothing like him. They look like his wife. So here I come along, and I'm like his twin. And the whole family's like, wow, where's this guy been for 50 years? So anyway, as Brent said, today's topic is pretty somber. It's not my typical vein of speaking. This is my first run on this presentation, so you guys are my test audience. But to give you a little background on me, my wife and I have been married for 34 years. We have 2 children, a boy and a girl, 31 and 29. And my wife is very, very supportive of my World War II enthusiasm. So I'm very thankful. Here we are today at the 8th Air Force meeting. As Brent mentioned, I work with the Atlanta World War II Roundtable as well, but here are some of the other groups that I work with. Obviously the museum, I've been down there countless times for book signings and lectures and things. Project Recover, that's where we find missing MIAs. They work a lot. They've found a lot of World War II veterans over the years, predominantly in the Pacific. And then obviously Honor Flight, the military writers, but the Orphan Network is a whole network of people who lost a parent or both parents in World War II. It's a very select group of people. And then obviously Purple Hearts United. I have 3 family members on a database to try to find their Purple Hearts. And then Folds of Honor is a great organization to provide scholarships to children of service members who have died. And this is really why I write, because of these 5 gentlemen. That's my mother's father, Archie, my dad's dad, Morris. I was adopted, as I mentioned, into this family, and at a very young age, I got to meet both of these gentlemen, and my grandmother gave me newspaper clippings of the other 3. I said, who are these other three? And they were my dad's uncles and cousins who all died in World War II. So my grandfathers both survived. Harold died near New Guinea on the USS Mount Hood that exploded. If you ever researched that explosion, he was on that boat. He was 18 years old. That's my father. He's holding in his left arm. He was 18 years old. Thomas died on Saipan. He was part of a howitzer battalion. Believe it or not, they were strafed from a Japanese Zero. They came from Guam. Flew in there and strafed them, and he died. His mother wrote Truman for years, trying to get his body brought back to the U.S., and she finally got it brought back. And then Norman died at the Battle of the Bulge. He was the oldest there. He was 34. So that's why I write. That's my passion. I want the memory of these 5 men to live forever. And these are my 4 books. I don't make money selling books. I just do it because I love it. It's a passion. I want to get the message out. Do I wish I was a famous author? I guess. I don't know what comes with that, right? But money. That's a good point. But Inherited Freedom obviously is about my military family. I had family members all the way back to the French and Indian War that served. Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War I, II, Vietnam. My dad was in the Air Force. The middle 2 books are it's historical fiction. So it's a fictional character going through all the events before, during, and after World War II. So this character inserts into all these pivotal points of World War II. It's almost like a James Bond type thing, but it's something I enjoyed. And somehow all of that came out of my head. I'm not quite sure how or why, but I liked writing those books. Now, why am I here today? It's because of this Corpse for a Mattress book. It's a very aggressive title, and I'll get into that here in a minute. But this came out a couple of months ago, and it's about Harry Rental. Okay. So I dedicated it to him, the Jewish people, and all the compromised individuals who were interned and murdered, by the millions between those years, 1938 and 1945. That's how the book is dedicated. My brother is an artist. He's a graphic artist as well, and he did all my book covers. And this was a pretty intense book cover because that's how Harry's story starts. Now, how in the world did I find Harry's story? This is Ted and Mary. They have both passed, but they lived in Endicott, New York. I was at a Friendly's restaurant. I was managing a call center in Endicott. I typically don't like to eat by myself, but I was hungry, so I went to a Friendly's restaurant down the street. I'm sitting there eating. Ted walks in with a younger woman, World War II hat on. Of course, I'm going to get up and I'm going to go talk to him. So I leave my meal, never finished it either. I went over and talked to him, and that developed a 5-year friendship. Both Ted and Mary both served in the Navy during World War II. That's how they met. He was on a submarine in the Pacific. He was a navigator. And that's how I met him. Wonderful couple. He died in 2017. His daughter went through his personal effects and saw on his shelf in his home was a weathered IBM envelope. She opened it up, glanced at it, thought I might want it. She ships it to me. I received that envelope in July of 2017. I open it. It's Harry's journal that he had written about his experiences in the concentration camps. I spent all of July 4th holiday pouring through that. I still have that envelope. How did Ted receive that from Harry? Well, Ted worked for IBM. He traveled to Sao Paulo, Brazil frequently and befriended Harry by happenstance. So what happened was, and I'll get into it in a second here, but Harry literally typed up his remembrance in a journal. It was all very cryptic and scattered and all that, but he put that in that envelope and sent it to Ted. You know when Ted received that envelope in Endicott, New York? 1977. 1977 until today, what's that, 47 years ago? Now Harry's story's coming to life. So when his daughter sent me his manuscript in 2017, I was just blown away. So let me, hopefully this isn't going to be too loud, but this is kind of the introduction. That's Hitler speaking.
Hier wird ein Gesetz alles Handeln bestimmen. Das Volk lebt nicht für die Wirtschaft und die Wirtschaft existiert nicht für das Kapital, sondern das Kapital dient der Wirtschaft und die Wirtschaft dem Volk. Und der Bruch der uns in den 14 Punkten Wilsons gemachten Zusicherungen begann für Deutschland, das heißt für das schaffende deutsche Volk, eine Zeit grenzenlosen Unglücks. Wäre ja auch ohne weiteres bereit, seine gesamte militärische Einrichtung überhaupt aufzulösen und den kleinen Rest der ihm verbliebenen Waffen zu zerstören, wenn die anliegenden Nationen ebenso restlos das Gleiche tun.
That's Harry in the far left. We found pictures of him in the concentration camps. So this is Harry. As Sarah mentioned in her quote there, I tell my stories so they might tell the next generation. You know, Harry wrote, he wrote his remembrances, more or less journaled it, and wrote it in German. They immigrated from German to Brazil. He lost that. Then he wrote it in Portuguese and misplaced that. Then he befriends Ted and types it up. Half it's German, half of it's in English, and he puts it in that IBM envelope, and then I get it, and then here we are today. That's insane. So this is Harry's timeline. He was born during the height of World War I in Czechoslovakia. He was born to Jewish parents. His father died when he was about 2.5 years old. He never really knew his father, never had a relationship with him. What happens to his mother? His mother marries a Catholic. She renounces her Jewish faith, becomes a Catholic, raises Harry as a Catholic. He professes to be a Catholic. World War II starts, 1939. Harry is working in Romania in a shipyard. He gets picked up. You're a Jew. He goes, no, I'm not. I'm Catholic. You're a Jew. Come with us. He goes to Berlin. He ends up at Auschwitz. He goes to Buchenwald. He goes to Dachau, where he's liberated. So this is really Harry's journey. You know, if you look here, this is, I'm trying to get it to show up, Mark.
It's showing.
Is it? So down in, I'll just go over here. So if you look, he's born in Czechoslovakia. He ends up down here at the shipyard in Romania. And then he ends up being captured, and he's taken all the way to Berlin. Then he ends up at Auschwitz. Then he goes to Buchenwald, and then he goes to Dachau. I'm sorry, this is where he was born. So he's born here, ends up in Romania, goes all the way up to Berlin, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. So I've had a lot of people ask me, why was he in 3 concentration camps? It's because he was in work detail. Him and a lot of millions of others, they worked him to death practically. So that's where he was captured in Romania, 1943. Again, he professes to be a Catholic, but he was born to Jewish parents. Somebody found out. When he went to Berlin, that was more of a holding center for people like that. Again, remember, he wasn't picked up in Warsaw. He wasn't picked up where a lot of the Jews were picked up. He was working. So they transported him and a lot of other people to Berlin, almost like a staging area. I was in Berlin in 2016 and just happened to take a tour and took these pictures. This is the building where Harry lived for practically 2 months before he went to Auschwitz. That's the very building, because he describes the building being right next to an old Jewish cemetery, because he was watching the Germans dig up the Jewish bodies out of the graves and burn them. That's what he was experiencing while he waits under house arrest in that very building. I just happened to snap those photos a year prior, not knowing that I would find this journal. And when he described that, I did my research, and that happened to be the very building and cemetery that he was in before he went to Auschwitz. So again, he's at those 3 concentration camps. Very unique for someone to visit 3. So the road to Auschwitz was built by hate but paved with indifference. That rail car that he left Berlin in and went to Auschwitz, it took them 20 hours. Not a long time to get from Berlin to Krakow, right? But 20 hours in a stinky rail car. He said he counted 34 people, including himself. So it wasn't overly loaded. They were given no food or water during that 20 hours. They all determined to use the corner of the rail car, to use the bathroom. The only sustenance that he had was given to him by an elderly woman who basically was responsible for feeding the people in that building I showed you. And she gave him some sandwiches. And that was the only sustenance that he had and shared for 20 hours. So he comes rolling into Auschwitz, and here's another picture that we found of Harry here at Auschwitz. This is Harry right here. So he showed up at Auschwitz in the middle of the night on his mother's birthday, June 29th, 1943. Now, I'm not going to sit here and talk about Auschwitz. Everybody knows the stories of Auschwitz and all that, but what I want to share is some of Harry's experience. So obviously he's very descriptive, and he talks about the dogs barking, right? Tons of children crying, people screaming. He witnessed a woman who had a young child. It was a young boy. The soldiers ripped the boy from her, and they pushed her right. Same line that Harry was in, right? She was young. They would put her to work. The little boy went left. She begged the soldier to give him back, begged, screamed, fell on her knees, eventually fought away, went back to her boy, and basically he never saw her again. They basically sent her with the boy away to die. So he describes that, and he said it seemed like hours. There were thousands of people there getting off the rail cars, and he talks about the separations, right? And you've seen the movies, you've seen the stories where people are separated right there, and they got to go left or right, and that lived with him forever. He got off the rail car at Auschwitz, and then him and his line of people had to walk to Buna, Auschwitz-Buna. Okay, so Buna was a work camp. Auschwitz had many sub-camps, and Buna was a work camp. mainly known for the Buna factory there, where they made rubber. So he worked in that factory for a long time. When he was at Auschwitz, obviously they were, stripped of their clothing. He was bare naked going through a line for over 2 hours. He kept his watch on, a Longinus chronometer his father had given him when he turned 21. The soldier behind the desk, I'm not going to try to speak German or you'll laugh at me if I do an accent, but basically, give me your watch. Give me your watch. And he refused to give it to him. Soldier, butt of a rifle up against his back, give up your watch, give up your watch. He refused to do it. So eventually, what does he do? He takes his watch off like this, okay? Throws it on the ground, took his foot and smashed it into 3 or 4 pieces, just smashed it, and said, "You will not have my watch." Now, that story, simple story, right? But it would have been lost to the sands of time. But it was a Longinus chronometer, and I've looked those up. Pretty simple watch, but he wasn't letting that guy have it. Everybody knows about the tattoos, left arm, forearm right here. He talks about that. 2 needles, they were not putting alcohol in between. It was 2 needles, a big vial of ink, and the guy was very good at putting those numbers on people's forearms, and he just watched tons of people before him, and he got to his arm, and he watched the guy tattoo into his left forearm 127067, and that was his number. He also talks about the infections that people would get from those tattoos. He said he saw people die through those infections. He said a lot of times their arms would swell up, and then they would get an infection in their bloodstream, and then they would die. Because everything else is compromised, right? It's not like you're eating sausage and gravy and vegetables every day, right? You're already compromised, and you get this tattoo and you get an infection in your arm. He talks a lot about, during his time at Auschwitz, being in the Buna factory. There's one point before he was shipped out to Buchenwald, he's at the factory, and this happened multiple times where they were bombed by Allied bombers. He describes looking overhead and seeing thousands, and he said that the sky would be darkened as these planes would fly over. And because he worked in a factory that the Germans were using for munitions, making rubber, making ball bearings, things like that, the factories would be bombed. And the soldiers didn't care a whole lot. The soldiers hid. Soldiers all disappeared and hid every time these bombings would happen. So Harry and his fellow prisoners had to find shelter. And he witnessed on multiple occasions people within feet of him dying from a building falling on them or bricks falling on them. And he somehow survived all that. But again, he describes seeing all those bombers come overhead countless times. It's not freedom from conditions, but it is freedom to take a stand toward the conditions. So again, that's a picture of Harry there to the right. He was not going to let them have his watch, and he stood his ground on multiple occasions. We found this other picture. Victor Hugo, Perseverance, Secret of All Triumphs. That's Harry right there in that line of people. So he gets sent to Buchenwald. Why did he get sent to Buchenwald, right? The Russians were getting close. They could hear gunfire off in the distance. It was the dead of night, and they basically put everybody on a forced march. And they marched for days. No food, no water. It started to snow. He talks about the bombings. They were bombed again. He'd see the bombers come over, and they drop and bomb these various towns and things like that. The march to Buchenwald was a combination of walking and then these open rail cars that the Germans had introduced. He's very descriptive when he's in that open rail car. He counted 110 people. I mean, they literally had a hard time breathing because they were so packed in there. People died left and right. And when they died, they typically were just thrown over the side and the train kept moving. He describes a lot of times on that journey to Buchenwald, they would stop in these rail centers, or the train would simply stop, right? They were waiting for more coal or whatever. He talks about on many, many occasions, local citizens coming up and giving them food, giving them water. Sometimes they would hand them alcohol bottles of stuff they had. There were other times where citizens would come up and throw rocks at them. One time a citizen threw a torch into the middle of the open rail car. So you had people that were very sympathetic and wanting to help, and then you had people that hated those people, right? The Jews, and they were making their journey even more difficult. But the majority of us, getting all the way from Auschwitz to Buchenwald, that's hundreds of miles, and he predominantly walked that whole way. There's a part where he talks about 5,100 people leaving Auschwitz that he was part of, and less than 1,200 showed up at Buchenwald. That's how many died along the way. So he's at Buchenwald as his second stop. Then Buchenwald was, that was a concentration camp in Germany, right? So Germany was having a hard time, northern end. The Russians are coming from the west, the Allies are, the US is coming from the east. This is where he talks about Corpse for a Mattress. How did I get that title? When he went from Buchenwald to Dachau, they put him in another closed rail car. And it was very packed. And he literally describes how cold it was and that people were dying left and right. And he literally describes a person that had died. He flipped them over and actually laid on them as a mattress because the body was still slightly warm. It was frigid. He had hardly any room to sleep on the splintered floor, right? There were so many people on that. So he literally flipped someone over because he couldn't look at them, and he laid on them for the night and fell asleep. So, it's a very aggressive title, but those are his words. At Dachau, for the first time, what he noticed was a lot of children that had been imprisoned, right? Somehow survived. Children were used for various purposes. Unfortunately, a lot of them were used for bad purposes, right? And the Germans used them. But he remembers being so many children in Dachau, and a sub part of Dachau. He describes that very vividly. Then the Nazis ultimately leave, right? It's too hard for them. They can't maintain security on these camps. They don't want to be found out. So liberation happened in May of 45. And I thought this quote was pretty spot on, but monsters exist because they are too few in number to be truly dangerous. More dangerous are the common men, the functionaries ready to believe and to act without asking questions. So that's a lot of what happened, right? Don't ask, just do it. So again, he's picked up in Romania, claims to be Roman Catholic, which he was, right? He was raised that way. Goes all the way through Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and ends up at Dachau. And he describes during his liberation, a soldier came up to him and he spoke in English to the guy and said, "Am I free?" And the guy thought he was British. He said, "Are you a limey?" And Harry goes, "What's a limey?" But he ends up being liberated there. Now, I live in Dahlonega. I live near my parents. 55 and older, yes, I qualify. One World War II veteran left in that neighborhood, okay? His name's Pete. What did Pete do? He was part of the Rainbow Division. He helped liberate Dachau. So I can honestly say Harry was with Pete on that day of liberation. Now, 2 weeks ago, Pete turned 99 years old. And I gave him a copy of this book. I told him it was coming. He was excited to read it. But I just thanked him for what he did and the liberation that he provided. And I told him, because of what he did, that book is available now to get out and share Harry's story. He played a pivotal part in that. So he just started crying. Then I felt terrible. But he was just so appreciative of that. So, you know, Harry exits these 3 concentration camps. And, you know, here's Harry again. Obviously, the 2 right pictures, but this is Harry right here. And then obviously here. He ends up helping to provide, he ends up with a police group that helps provide security for a lot of the U.S. things near Nuremberg, right? Air bases, fuel depots, whatever it is. His security team provided security to support the Americans in and around Munich after the war. And you can see, obviously, he gained weight back, and he enjoyed that time. So he's in Munich working, and he finds Angelise. She's working there as a secretary, and he ends up marrying her. 1949. Then he immigrates to Brazil in 1955. He came out of Italy, ended up in São Paulo area. His mother had a sister who had immigrated several years prior, and she raved about this area of Brazil, and they thought it'd be a good idea to get out of Germany and forget the past and start a new life. So that's why they immigrated to Brazil. So I will tell you, I get his manuscript again in July of 2017. I find out that he had passed. How in the world did I connect the dots? Well, I do a lot of research. I find an email address, a work email address for a woman named Dolly Rental in São Paulo, Brazil. I said, probably not her, right? Not the right person. I email her. It's a work email. I was pretty descriptive who I was. I didn't want to think I was stalking her or anything like that, right? I'm an author, all that good stuff. So believe it or not, 4 days later, she replies to me. She goes, I'm Harry's daughter. So I tell her what I have in my hands, and she goes, I heard that my father wrote something, and he journaled it, and I don't know much about it. What's in it? And I go, well, he's pretty descriptive, and he talks about his time in the concentration camps. Again, the journal was, a lot of it was in German. He did a lot of flashback remembrances to other camps, so I spent 7 years putting it into a book format, doing a lot of research, and then editing it. I had it edited. So her and I we've kept up a relationship for 7 years. She gave me a lot of information what happened to Harry after the war, right? His marriage. She sent me a lot of these pictures. Harry and his wife had a son and a daughter. That's Harry Jr. on the left, and that's Dolly there on the right. Harry was actually born in Germany before they left, and then Dolly was born in Brazil. So I have had a 7-year relationship with Dolly Rental, who provides me a ton of information that I am able to put in the back half of the book that talks about what happened to him after the war. He ended up working in the textile industry in Brazil. He ultimately ended up working for Singer Sewing. And that's how he met Ted, who gave, his manuscript I ended up having. So he had a very, very successful career, raised his family there in Brazil. And in the later years, he rode a motorcycle, which I thought was pretty cool. And this was a couple months before he died. He died in 1999. And again, Dolly was able to provide me a lot of these photos. So what happens, Harry and his wife immigrate to Brazil. They have a son and a daughter. Harry died again in 1999. Now their headstones are a little bit different down there. So he died on March 17th, 1999. Well, look at his wife, Annalise. She died on September 2nd, 2023. She knew I was writing this. She knew I was putting Harry's story in print, and his story was going to get out there, and she was so appreciative and so thankful. But unfortunately, she passed before the book came out. So, but again, Harry's just one of millions and millions of people that were interned. I mean, they estimate, I think in Europe there were over 9 million Jews before World War II. After the war, there was 3 million. And then you have all the other people that were killed alongside them, right? Harry's just one of millions or thousands that successfully survived. He's nobody famous. I'm nobody famous. Harry's story now is out there for everyone to remember. So, about a year ago, I sent a draft of this book to Dolly down in Brazil. I sent her several copies. I had the family read it. I said, I want them to be comfortable with the title. I want them to be comfortable with the content. I want them to know everything that's in the book before the world sees it, right? That inspires Dolly. 2 months ago, she traveled. She has children that live in Europe, but she had never been to Auschwitz. She had never been to Buchenwald. She had never been to Dachau. When she read that draft and put together what we were doing here, it inspired her to go to Europe and visit all 3 of those camps. I kid you not, the day that book came out a few months ago, I get an email from her. She's in Europe, and she just sent me this long email of appreciation, of thanks, and that her father will never be forgotten. And that inspired her to go to these camps. And she said she just felt it gave her, again, he didn't die in the camps, right? But he experienced that. Her whole life, she sees the tattoo on his arm. So it put closure for her. So this is Harry Jr. That's Dolly, so that's Harry, and that's Angelise in the middle. So that's Harry's wife, and that's his 2 children. And then these other pictures are just countless pictures of their 7 grandchildren. So they have a few that live in Brazil. They also have several that live in Germany. So, Harry survives, has 2 wonderful children, and they end up having 7 children now who have lives and have children themselves. So, very, very successful story. So that was it. So, again, it's a very dark read. It doesn't talk about, when Harry was born and he had his first toy and things like that. It really pops right into his capture and what happened to him. And I've been asked, like Andy, Caleb, they bought the book, and I told Andy, I said, just make sure that Caleb's mature enough to read some of this, because the content of it's pretty dark. I mean, he talks a lot about what happened in the camps with the children and all the experiments and stuff like that too, so it's pretty descriptive. But again, everybody's seen movies about these things. You would think you're well versed, but then you read something like this and you're like, wow, that's pretty raw. So it's pretty descriptive. But again, that's why I wanted to put a lot of stuff in the back half that talks about his marriage, raising 2 children, having a successful career, having 7 grandchildren, and then I so wish I could have met him. I do plan to travel to Brazil in the spring and visit the family for the first time, and also pay my respects at his grave. And my son's a videographer. He's going to go with me, and we're going to film all that and, you know, kind of put that as a bow on all of this. So I appreciate your time today. So can I take